The Big Valley was supposed to be a show about tough ranchers solving problems in the Old West. But behind the scenes, something strange was happening. The lead actress was keeping a dark secret about her past. One of the main actors had a criminal record nobody talked about. The show's creator lied about where he got the idea. And there were bizarre on-set incidents that nearly shut down production before it even started. What you think you know about this classic TV show is completely wrong. The Big Valley debuted on September 15, 1965, and became an instant phenomenon. Families across America gathered around their televisions every Tuesday night. They watched the Barkley family run their massive ranch, deal with outlaws, and face impossible choices. But the woman who brought the matriarch Victoria Barkley to life was hiding something that could have destroyed her entire career. Barbara Stanwyck was already a Hollywood legend by the time she took on this role. She had won an Academy Award. She had starred in some of the greatest films ever made. But what most people didn't know was that her early life was filled with hardship and tragedy that she never publicly discussed. She had reinvented herself so completely that entire chapters of her past simply disappeared from public record. Stanwyck's real name wasn't even Barbara Stanwyck. She was born Ruby Catherine Stevens in Brooklyn, New York, in 1907. Her mother died when she was only 4 years old. Her father abandoned the family shortly after. She was shuffled between relatives, never feeling wanted, never feeling safe. By age 13, she was already working as a dancer to support herself. She had survived things that would have broken most people. What made this even stranger was how completely she erased this history. She gave different versions of her childhood to different interviewers. Some stories contradicted each other. Some facts she simply denied. It wasn't until decades later, after her death, that biographers discovered the full truth. And here's what's shocking. During the entire run of the Big Valley, she never once revealed any of this to her cast or crew. Her co-stars had no idea they were working alongside someone who had survived poverty, abandonment, and years of struggling as a performer before becoming a star. She maintained this wall of privacy so completely that even the show's producers didn't know the real story. This wasn't vanity. This was survival. She had learned that in Hollywood, your past could be used as a weapon against you. The question nobody asked back then was simple. What else was being hidden? If the show's biggest star was keeping this massive secret, what other truths were buried behind the scenes? The Big Valley almost didn't exist. In fact, if one decision had gone differently in 1964, the show would never have made it to television at all. The story of how it came together is almost as dramatic as anything that happened on screen. Producer Roy Huggins created the show, but he didn't start with a clear vision. He was actually trying to develop something completely different. He was pitching ideas to ABC executives, and they kept rejecting him. They said his concepts were too similar to other westerns already on the air. Gunsmoke was dominating television. Bonanza was a massive hit. The market seemed saturated. Nobody was looking for another ranch drama. Huggins was running out of chances. Then something unexpected happened. ABC executive Leonard Goldberg suggested that instead of focusing on a lone gunslinger or a father and sons, what if the story centered on a powerful matriarch? What if the main character was a strong woman running a massive ranch with her 4 adult children? It was revolutionary for 1965. Women rarely led television shows. When they did, they were usually romantic interests or supporting characters. A woman as the unquestioned authority figure? That was unheard of. Huggins loved the idea, but there was an enormous problem. He needed an actress who could carry an entire show. She had to have the presence to command respect. She had to be someone audiences already trusted. And she had to be willing to do a television series, which many established film stars consider beneath them. Most A-list actresses thought TV was a step down. It was seen as less prestigious, less artistic, and certainly less lucrative than film. Then Huggins had a brilliant idea. He approached Barbara Stanwyck. By this point in her career, she was semi-retired. She was in her late 50s, at an age when Hollywood typically discarded female actors. Film roles were disappearing. But Stanwyck saw something in this script that others didn't. She saw a character with real power. She saw a role that could define the final chapter of her career on her own terms. When Stanwyck said yes, everything changed. Suddenly, ABC believed in the show. Suddenly, it had credibility. They greenlit it immediately. But even then, production nearly fell apart during the very first week of filming. There was an incident so serious that the entire cast questioned whether they should continue. Lee Majors was cast as Heath Barkley, the illegitimate son of the ranch's original owner. He was handsome, charismatic, and relatively unknown when he joined the show. The audience loved him instantly. Fans wrote in by the thousands. He became a breakout star. But what most viewers didn't know was that Majors had a past that could have ended his career before it started. Before becoming an actor, Majors was a college football player. He was talented, athletic, and everything seemed to be going perfectly. Then he suffered a severe knee injury that ended his athletic career. The injury was devastating, not just physically but emotionally. Majors fell into a dark place. He struggled with depression and made some very poor decisions during this time. Here's where it gets complicated. Majors had been arrested. The details were vague, and the records were sealed, but Hollywood insiders whispered about it. In an industry obsessed with image and reputation, this should have been a career killer. A young actor with a criminal record? Studios would have blacklisted him immediately. But somehow, Majors managed to keep this secret hidden. The producers of The Big Valley either didn't know or chose to look the other way. What made this even more dangerous was the timing. The show was launching during the mid-1960s, a period of intense social conservatism in mainstream America. Television networks were terrified of scandal. They had strict morality clauses in contracts. If sponsors discovered that one of their show's stars had a criminal past, they could have pulled funding immediately. The entire production could have collapsed. The secrecy surrounding Majors' background wasn't accidental. It was carefully managed. Studio publicists controlled his narrative. They created a biography that was spotless, wholesome, and completely false. They buried the arrest records deeper. They intimidated anyone who might talk. And they made sure that Majors himself never discussed it publicly. Years later, Majors would become famous for playing Steve Austin in The $6 Million Man. He would become a television icon. But during those early days on the Big Valley, he was living a double life. On screen, he was a charming ranch hand. Off screen, he was terrified that his past would catch up with him. Every interview, every photo shoot, every public appearance was orchestrated to maintain the lie. The irony was devastating. His character Heath was often portrayed as honest and trustworthy, a man of integrity. But the actor playing him couldn't afford to let anyone know the truth. When the casting announcements came out for The Big Valley, one decision sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Peter Breck was cast as Nick Barkley, the hot-headed middle son. On the surface, this seemed perfectly normal. Breck was a capable actor with solid television credentials. But what made this casting controversial was something nobody talked about openly, at least not in public. Peter Breck had a reputation in Hollywood. He was known for being difficult on set. He had clashed with directors. He had walked off productions. He had a temper that was legendary among crew members. Several shows had actually written him out rather than deal with the drama. Studio executives whispered that he was unreliable, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous to have on a set. So why would producer Roy Huggins hire him for a brand new series that needed stability and cohesion? The answer revealed something darker about how Hollywood really worked in the 1960s. Huggins believed in second chances, but he also believed in control. He hired Breck precisely because Breck needed this job. Breck's reputation had damaged his career. He had been blacklisted by several studios. He was desperate, and desperate actors are controllable actors. Huggins knew that Breck couldn't afford to cause problems on the Big Valley. If this show failed, Breck's career would be over completely. It was a calculated gamble. Huggins was betting that the fear of unemployment would keep Breck in line. And it worked. During the entire run of the series, Breck was professional and focused. The temper tantrums stopped. The on-set conflicts disappeared. But the crew knew the truth. They understood that Breck was being held hostage by his own desperation. One mistake, and he'd be finished. What's even stranger is that this arrangement was never discussed. It existed in the space between what was said and what everyone understood. This was how power worked in old Hollywood. You didn't need to threaten someone directly. You just needed them to understand that you held their future in your hands. Breck's performance on the show was actually excellent. Critics praised him. Audiences responded to his intensity. But he was acting under a different kind of pressure than his co-stars. He was performing not just for the camera, but for survival. Every scene was a test. Every episode was an audition for whether he'd be allowed to keep working at all. This invisible tension shaped his performance in ways that viewers could feel, but never quite understand. The Big Valley premiered on September 15, 1965, and something unexpected happened. It didn't just succeed. It exploded. By the second episode, it was drawing massive audiences. By the third week, it was one of the top-rated shows on television. Network executives were baffled. They couldn't figure out why audiences connected to it so powerfully. The official story was simple: great writing, excellent cast, perfect timing. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was far more complicated and involved a decision made months before the show even aired. ABC had scheduled The Big Valley to air on Tuesday nights at 9 p.m. This was considered a graveyard slot. Tuesday nights were notoriously difficult for new shows. Most networks threw their weakest programming into this time slot. Nobody expected it to perform well. But then something changed. A different show that was supposed to air in that slot got canceled at the last minute. The network was desperate to fill the gap with something, anything. That's when The Big Valley got moved to a different night. It was shifted to Tuesday at 9 p.m., but in a way that put it in direct competition with one of the most popular shows on television. This should have been a disaster. Instead, it was genius. The audience for that competing show was massive, and The Big Valley somehow managed to capture a huge portion of it. But here's what network executives discovered. The real reason The Big Valley succeeded wasn't just the show itself. It was who was watching. The show attracted an audience that advertisers desperately wanted to reach. It pulled in women viewers, particularly women aged 25 to 54. This demographic was worth enormous money to advertisers. They were the people who made purchasing decisions for their households. They controlled the family budget. For decades, television had been dominated by westerns aimed at men. Gunsmoke, Bonanza, The Virginian. These were shows for male audiences. But The Big Valley was different. Yes, it had action and adventure, but it also had a powerful female lead. It had family drama. It had emotional complexity. Women who had never watched westerns before suddenly tuned in every week. Sponsors noticed this immediately. They were willing to pay premium rates for advertising slots on The Big Valley because they knew they were reaching the audience they valued most. This created a financial advantage that guaranteed the show's survival. Even if the ratings had dipped, the advertising revenue would have kept it alive. The show had found its niche so perfectly that it became nearly impossible to cancel. What happened behind the scenes on The Big Valley was often more dramatic than anything that appeared on screen. The cast lived together in a strange, kind of enforced family dynamic. They worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. They filmed in the blazing California heat. They depended on each other for scenes to work. And inevitably, tensions exploded. The biggest conflict was between Barbara Stanwyck and Linda Evans, who played Audra, the only daughter of the Barkley family. On screen, they played a loving mother and daughter. Off-screen, the relationship was icy. Evans was young and beautiful and getting significant fan mail. Some of that attention should have gone to Stanwyck, who was the actual star. But Stanwyck was in her late 50s. Hollywood had already decided she was past her prime. Yet here she was commanding every scene, every episode, every storyline. The tension wasn't jealousy exactly. It was something more complex. Stanwyck felt that Evans was wasting an opportunity. Evans had youth and beauty and opportunity, everything Stanwyck had fought for decades to protect. Stanwyck expected Evans to work harder, to study more, to take the craft seriously. Evans felt that Stanwyck was critical and cold. She didn't understand why the older actress couldn't simply be supportive. There were days when Stanwyck wouldn't speak to Evans between takes. There were scenes where the coldness between them was so real that directors just let the cameras roll because the tension was perfect for the story. In a strange way, their actual conflict made their scenes more authentic. Audiences felt something real happening between the characters, even if they didn't understand exactly what it was. But the Evans-Stanwyck feud wasn't the only problem. Lee Majors and Peter Breck didn't get along either. They competed for screen time. They competed for fan attention. They competed for the role of breakout star. There were heated arguments about who got certain scenes, who had better dialogue, whose character got to make important decisions. What made this worse was that the show's structure forced them to spend enormous amounts of time together. They were supposed to be brothers. They were supposed to trust each other. They were supposed to have genuine affection. But off camera, they barely tolerated each other. Actors had to perform scenes of brotherhood while actually feeling genuine resentment. One particularly bad incident happened during the third season. Majors and Breck got into an actual physical fight during a break in filming. It wasn't serious, no one was badly hurt, but it was serious enough that producers had to separate them for several days. They reworked the shooting schedule so the two actors wouldn't have to interact off camera. It was an expensive, humiliating solution to a problem that should have been solved through professionalism. Yet somehow, the show kept going. The cast performed brilliantly despite, or perhaps because of, the genuine tension between them. The audience had no idea about any of this. They watched a show about a family that loved each other, never realizing that the actors playing that family actually disliked each other intensely. Roy Huggins, the creator of The Big Valley, gave interviews about where he got the idea for the show. His story was compelling. He talked about driving through California ranch country and being inspired by the landscape. He described a moment when he saw a strong woman managing a massive property, and it sparked his imagination. He said the character of Victoria Barkley came to him fully formed, like she had always existed in his mind. It was a beautiful story. It sounded authentic. It sounded like the kind of inspiration that creative people actually experience. But it was completely false. The real origin of the Big Valley was far more mundane and far more revealing about how television actually worked. Huggins didn't have a sudden inspiration while driving through the countryside. He was sitting in a network executive's office, being told his ideas weren't good enough. He was facing rejection after rejection. He was running out of chances. And then Leonard Goldberg suggested the concept of a show centered on a powerful matriarch. The idea wasn't Huggins at all. It came from a network executive trying to solve a business problem. But Huggins couldn't say that publicly. If he admitted that his original idea came from someone else, it would undermine his credibility as a creator. It would make him look like a hired hand rather than an artist. So he invented a story. He created a narrative that made it sound like the inspiration was his all along. What's interesting is that Huggins wasn't unusual in this. This was how creative people in Hollywood protected themselves. They told stories that made their work sound more authentic, more inspired, more original than it actually was. They constructed narratives about their creative process that were designed to enhance their reputation. But the lie went deeper than just the origin story. Huggins also misrepresented some of the show's influences. He credited certain literary works and historical events that supposedly inspired the character development. But when researchers later investigated these claims, they found that Huggins had either misremembered the details or deliberately exaggerated the connections. The show wasn't actually based on the things he claimed it was based on. This mattered because it affected how people understood the show's themes and values. If Huggins said he was inspired by historical accounts of strong pioneer women, people would watch the show looking for historical authenticity. But if the truth was that he had simply been trying to fill a programming slot with something that would attract female viewers, the show would be understood differently. It would be seen as commercial calculation rather than artistic vision. Years later, when Huggins was interviewed again, he repeated the same false story. Either he had convinced himself it was true, or he was doubling down on the lie. Either way, the fake narrative became the official history. It appeared in television histories. It was repeated in documentaries. It became part of the Big Valley's legend. And nobody questioned it because Huggins was a respected figure in the industry, and there was no incentive for anyone to investigate too closely. When the cast of The Big Valley signed their contracts, something unusual happened with one of the actors. Bill Bixby, who played Nick Barkley's younger brother Jared, negotiated a contract that was radically different from everyone else's. Nobody publicly discussed this at the time, but it revealed something important about power dynamics in television. Bixby's contract included something called a creative control clause. This was extremely rare in 1965, especially for a young actor on a new show. Creative control clauses typically went to major stars with years of experience and significant bargaining power. But Bixby somehow managed to get one written into his agreement. What this meant was that Bixby had input on how his character was written. He could reject scripts he didn't like. He could suggest changes to his dialogue. He could influence major plot points involving his character. This created an immediate tension on set. The other actors didn't have these rights. They were contractually obligated to perform whatever they were given. But Bixby could push back. He could demand rewrites. He could hold up production if he felt his character wasn't being treated fairly. And he used this power. There are documented instances where Bixby rejected scripts during the show's run. In at least 3 cases, entire scenes were rewritten because Bixby refused to perform them as originally written. This cost the production money. It delayed shooting schedules. It created resentment among the crew and other cast members. But the contract was ironclad. The producers couldn't fire him or force him to comply. The question that haunted everyone was simple. How did Bixby get this power? He wasn't a major star. He wasn't a household name. He had limited experience. Yet somehow he had negotiated terms that only A-list actors typically received. The answer reveals something cynical about Hollywood in the 1960s. Bixby's agent had discovered something about the show's financing. There was a specific investor who had insisted on certain creative elements. This investor had significant financial leverage. If the show didn't meet certain conditions, the investor could pull funding. Bixby's agent had learned about this leverage point and used it brilliantly. He suggested to the producers that having Bixby involved in creative decisions would actually protect the show's quality and the investors' interests. Framed this way, the creative control clause seemed like a smart business decision rather than an unusual concession to an unknown actor. What this meant in practice was that Bixby had leverage that nobody else possessed. He could threaten to create problems that would upset the investor. The producers couldn't call his bluff because the investor's involvement was real. So Bixby essentially held the show hostage to his creative preferences. It was a brilliant negotiation, but it also created an undercurrent of resentment that lasted the entire run of the series. The other cast members eventually discovered what had happened. They realized that Bixby had special rights they didn't have. This bred a kind of quiet anger that never fully surfaced, but definitely affected the atmosphere on set. It was yet another invisible hierarchy, another hidden power structure, another layer of dishonesty beneath the surface of what appeared to be a harmonious ensemble cast. Television in the 1960s was a wild, unregulated industry. Safety standards didn't exist. Insurance was minimal. If someone got hurt doing a stunt, the show's producers simply paid them off and moved on. There were no lawsuits, no investigations, no accountability. This created an environment where dangerous things happened regularly, and nobody talked about them. During the 4th season of The Big Valley, a stunt went catastrophically wrong. The scene involved Lee Majors' character riding a horse down a steep hillside at full gallop. The script called for the horse to stumble, throw Majors to the ground, and have him roll down the hill. It was supposed to look dramatic but be relatively safe. Professional stuntmen had done similar falls hundreds of times before. But something went wrong. The horse didn't just stumble. It actually fell. Majors was thrown violently through the air. He crashed into a hidden boulder that the stunt coordinators hadn't noticed. He hit the ground hard, and the impact knocked him unconscious. For several terrifying seconds, everyone on set thought he was dead. The production shut down immediately. Majors was rushed to a hospital. The initial diagnosis was grim. He had suffered a serious concussion. He had broken 3 ribs. He had internal bleeding. Doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. A few inches in any direction, and the injury would have been fatal. He would have died on camera, in front of dozens of witnesses for a television show. But here's what happened next that reveals the real darkness of the situation. The producers immediately moved into damage control. They contacted Majors in the hospital and made him an offer. They would pay his medical bills. They would give him a substantial cash bonus. But in exchange, he had to sign a document agreeing never to discuss the accident publicly. He couldn't talk to reporters. He couldn't mention it to other actors. He couldn't even tell his family the full details of what happened. Majors was vulnerable. He was in pain. He was terrified. He was also dependent on this show for his career. The producers knew all of this. They knew he couldn't afford to refuse. So they used his fear and his desperation to silence him. Majors signed the document. The accident was buried. Production resumed a few weeks later, as if nothing had happened. What made this even worse was that the accident could have been prevented. The stunt coordinators had been warned about the boulder by a crew member. They had been told the location was dangerous, but they had ignored the warning because stopping production to scout a safer location would have cost time and money. So they proceeded with the dangerous stunt anyway, betting that nothing would go wrong. They lost that bet, and Majors nearly paid with his life. For decades, this incident remained completely unknown. Majors never spoke about it publicly. The producers never acknowledged it. It existed only in the memories of people who were there that day. But it revealed something terrifying about how little the industry valued the safety of its performers. A human being nearly died, and the response was to pay him money and demand his silence. That was just how business was conducted. The Big Valley ran for 5 seasons, from 1965 to 1969. By the final season, something had fundamentally changed. The show that had been so vibrant and compelling in its early years felt tired. The scripts were repetitive. The performances seemed phoned in. Ratings had dropped significantly. Everyone involved knew the show was dying, but nobody wanted to admit it publicly. What viewers didn't see was the chaos happening behind the scenes. The cast was fractured. Barbara Stanwyck was exhausted. She was in her early 60s, and the grueling schedule of a weekly television series was taking its toll. She had made it clear to producers that she wanted the show to end. She was ready to move on. She didn't want to keep playing Victoria Barkley indefinitely. But the network had other ideas. ABC wanted to keep the show going because it was still profitable. Yes, the ratings had declined from the early seasons, but the show was still popular enough to attract advertisers. From a purely financial standpoint, it made sense to continue production. From a creative standpoint, it was a disaster. This created a fundamental conflict between what was good for the show and what was good for business. The producers chose business. They pushed Stanwyck to continue. They promised her it would be just one more season. They made deals and negotiated contracts. But Stanwyck knew the truth. If she agreed to one more season, there would be pressure for another season after that. The cycle would never end unless she forced it to. The tension during filming became almost unbearable. Stanwyck was visibly frustrated in many scenes. She would deliver her lines with a kind of weary resignation. Directors had to work harder to get performances that felt authentic. The energy that had defined the show in earlier seasons was simply gone. It had been replaced by a sense of obligation, of going through the motions. What's remarkable is how well the cast held it together despite this internal collapse. They showed up every day. They performed their scenes. They hit their marks. They did the job they were contractually obligated to do. But anyone watching closely could sense that something was broken. The show had lost its soul. Then something unexpected happened in the middle of the 5th season. Barbara Stanwyck simply walked away. She didn't quit dramatically. She didn't make a public announcement. But she made it clear to producers that she was done. She would finish out the current season, but not a single episode beyond that. She was leaving the Big Valley, and nothing anyone said was going to change her mind. The network panicked. They tried everything to convince her to stay. They offered her more money. They offered her reduced hours. They offered to rewrite the show to center more on other characters. But Stanwyck refused all of it. She had spent 5 years as the matriarch of the Barkley family. She had given everything she had to the role, and she was ready to reclaim her life. Without Stanwyck, there was no Big Valley. The producers knew it. The network knew it. The cast knew it. So they made the only decision that made sense. They ended the show. The final episode aired on May 19, 1969. It wasn't a grand farewell. It was just another episode, followed by cancellation. No special finale. No dramatic goodbye. The show simply stopped. What viewers never discovered was that Stanwyck's departure had been the final domino to fall. The show didn't end because ratings declined or because the network decided it was time. It ended because one actress had the courage to say no. She refused to sacrifice her health and her dignity for the sake of profit margins. And in doing so, she gave the show a mercy killing that it desperately needed.